Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're going to wait just a couple of minutes to give everybody a chance to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. All Redistricting is Local, a media briefing hosted by the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, Georgia Redistricting Alliance, and Ethnic Media Services. We're here with partners, advocates, and citizens to raise awareness about the threat and challenges this local redistricting session poses to Georgia citizens. Before we begin, we have some housekeeping notes. To start, all attendees have been muted to limit background noise as much as possible. This briefing is being recorded and we've enabled closed captioning. If there are technical difficulties with closed captioning, or if you have other accessibility issues, please let us know in the chat. After the event, we will email a recording of the briefing as well as a written transcript to registrants. You may use the information shared today for your news content with attribution to the appropriate panelists. We have separate channels being translated into Spanish, Korean, and Mandarin. If you have not yet been added to one of those channels but would like to be, please ask to be added in the Q&A box. If there are additional ways that we can make this briefing more accessible for you, your audiences, or your coworkers, please let us know. We will have a Q&A at the end of the briefing. However, you may pose a question at any point during the briefing by clicking the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. This will open a window where you can type your questions. Be sure to include your name and news outlet or affiliation. We may modify or combine questions to cover as many as we can during the Q&A portion. If your question is not answered, please email us at press@splcenter.org, and we will put that link in the chat and send it around. We don't anticipate any technical difficulties during today's briefing. However, if there are any challenges, our speakers may temporarily go off camera to continue the program. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Susanna Scott from the Georgia Redistricting Alliance.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you to the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Southern Coalition for Social Justice for hosting this very important discussion with activists and citizens who are combating these disastrous local redistricting laws in Georgia. Today's media briefing will focus on local maps being drawn by the Georgia Legislature, such as the Cobb County map, which passed within the last hour, as well as the Gwinnett County and Athens-Clarke County maps, which were signed by the governor earlier this month. Redistricting takes place at least once every 10 years after each decennial census to ensure that districts at every level of government are as close to equal in population as possible to ensure each voter's vote carries an equal weight. A fair and transparent redistricting process is fundamental to good democracy. When voters have faith in the redistricting process and believe it has been conducted fairly, they feel more engaged in the political process and have faith in the government that they help to enact. It is incumbent on us to call out flawed redistricting processes and demand better from our legislators. I'm pleased to introduce today's panelists who are leading the fight, including Poi Winichakul from the Southern Poverty Law Center's staff attorney for voting rights. Poi's work focuses heavily on issues of voting access and democratic representation in Georgia. Aunna Dennis, Executive Director of Common Cause Georgia. Aunna combines her passion for social impact, culture, boots on the ground organizing, policy, and elections to affect real change for Georgia's citizens. Laura Judge, a Cobb County resident and parent of students attending Cobb County schools. Laura would be drawn into a new district under the new map being advanced in Georgia's legislature and has testified against local redistricting legislation. And Maria Sheik and Sadie McIntyre both are activists with the Georgia Youth Justice Coalition. So let's kick things off with Poi from the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Thank you, Susanna, and thank you everyone who's joining us today. Again, my name is Poi Winichakul, and I'm a staff attorney with the Southern Poverty Law Center's Voting Rights Practice Group. I just wanted to start off my remarks today to set the stage for today's discussion. This is an unprecedented local redistricting session and legislative session that we've never seen before. This is the first redistricting cycle where Georgia has not been covered under the Voting Rights Act Section 5 pre-clearance requirement. And this is because in 2013, the Supreme Court in a court case called Shelby County v. Holder nullified the protections under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which would have formerly required the Department of Justice to pre-clear or take a second look at all kinds of maps, not just the state and congressional maps that are being passed in Georgia, but also those that we are seeing rammed through the legislature right now at the county level, in the counties that Susanna mentioned, for instance. And so what we're seeing right now is district drawing that has not been transparent, that has not had public input, public hearing, or contributions from the public, and instead is being usurped by the state legislature to draw district lines without, even many input from local elected officials. This is a process, the legislature has used a specific process that has not been used before and in order to make sure to get the maps that they want. And we're really concerned about how fast things are moving and how little the public has had a chance to weigh in on these maps that have lasting impact at the local level for the next decade. So with that, I'll just turn it over to the many wonderful speakers we have today who can discuss more about their work and about the impact that these maps have on them as voters.
Thank you, Poi. Next up, we have Aunna with Common Cause Georgia.
Good afternoon, y'all, and thank you, Susanna and Poi, for setting the tone. I'm Aunna, and I am the Executive Director of Common Cause Georgia, and we work in Georgia to uplift the need for transparency and ethical nature of our governmental processes, including redistricting, all the way to having more access to the ballot box. So I'll just start off with saying that, our democracy can only work if everyone is fully and equally represented, regardless of race, party affiliation, zip code, and everything in between. We know how important the right to vote is in Georgia, particularly, and how the effort is and nationwide, and what's happening to make it harder for people to vote in Georgia, especially people who are BIPOC. But attacks on our right to vote hasn't stopped just with our ballot box. It's really playing out in our local redistricting process, and it's rearing its ugly head. Gerrymandering or drawing voting maps that make it harder for communities of color to elect candidates of their choice is part of a long game attempt by people who want to keep our communities from our voices from being heard. And they really want to control what happens in our communities, from our kitchen tables to how our trash is being picked up to what type of candidates we're able to elect in our districts. We've seen this play out in the Georgia legislature with our mapping process. What we've seen is that there has been a changing of the rulemaking procedures. There hasn't been adequate time or addressing the community on the map making processes. Also, local delegations have not been brought into the conversation, or they've been brought into the conversation just to be railroaded into different maps being presented. And so at Common Cause Georgia, we're working with our coalition partners at the Georgia Redistricting Alliance, with our legal advocate partners like SPLC and the Southern Justice Coalition to really say to the rest of the country that this has to stop and we need a change, particularly in Georgia, because we are not covered by different sections of the Voting Rights Act as it stands now. And we need federal protections and we need state protections, but we also need a legislature who actually works for the community and works for the people and not for their special interests. So thank you so much for hearing me today. Now I'll kick it back over to Susanna.
Thank you, Aunna. Our next panelist is Laura Judge, a resident and parent in Cobb County.
Hello, my name is Laura Judge. I'm a parent in Cobb County, and specifically in the East Cobb area, represented by Cobb School Board Post 6 and Cobb Commission District 2. Where I live in the current Post 6 and District 2 community is an area where I will lose both of the representatives that I elected. As a taxpayer and a member of a nonpartisan grassroots organization called Watching the Funds Cobb, I have been disappointed by several actions of the school board in Cobb, whose majority sometimes seems like they are just checking boxes and not trying to help students. Every time we have come to the school board to make our voices heard, it feels like we have hit a wall. They do not respond to public testimony, and some school board members have argued with other members when asking important questions. Our school board chair recently changed the rule that requires a majority of the board to support a measure to introduce it for consideration. Now, the state legislature has put forward a map for the Cobb County School Board that defends the current majority at the expense of fair representation for Black voters. Just like the school board, the state legislatures are rushing their maps through while refusing to listen to community input. The redistrict maps that crack apart or pack together Cobb communities represent another wall preventing us from making our voices heard. Our children are forced to live in a toxic environment when parents do not have a fair voice to advocate for their needs and interests. Literacy rates across Georgia have been dropping, but when our elected board members try to introduce a review of our literacy teaching, and when we try to update our methods, it was not even considered because of the school board rules. The school board has failed to properly address anti-Semitic imagery in schools despite pleas from parents, and dissolved a board of parents and students considering new names for a school named after a Confederate figure. Children with learning differences and their parents also feel like they cannot advocate for their needs or interests to the school board. Because the voices of parents have been totally marginalized, it feels like issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion are not being addressed at all. To not have our voices heard while we continue to pay taxes to the school board and see our money misspent is especially troubling. The school board hired a law firm through a sole source contract to draw up their new map when the responsibility belonged to the Cobb delegation. The school board is paying this firm $18,000 a month, and the bill's author is married to the chief executive of the firm's subsidiary. Would you allow that in your community? The bill HB 1028, which does the Cobb School Board map, also takes away my opportunity to vote for a school board member for an additional 2 years. It is also my understanding that approximately 55,000 voters in my school board post will be affected in this way, and over 100,000 voters in Cobb County in total. Post 6 voted and elected Sharice Davis as our school board representative, and we deserve an opportunity to vote in the 2022 election for either her re-election or the next board member. Meanwhile, Bill HB 1154, which does the Cobb Commission map, removes my elected commissioner approximately 1 year into her term. District 2 voted and elected Jerica Richardson as our county commissioner. She has been drawn out of her district regardless of her residence. During the time that I have lived in Cobb, I have known of North, South, East, and West Cobb as communities of interest. There is not a transportation or transit community of Cobb that runs along the I-75 corridor, which one House representative has mentioned, nor is there a middle of Cobb district that includes the urbanization along I-75, as another representative stated. Again, the state legislators have rushed their maps through while refusing to listen to the community or get the commissioner's input. The redistricted map has cracked apart the current District 2 Cobb County community after voting for our commissioner, which makes our voices seem irrelevant. Georgia state legislatures should not be allowed to disenfranchise voters like this. They should not be submitting bills to go around the rules that were set out by the Speaker of the House just because they are now in the minority, and they should not be depriving us of fair opportunity for input. The only way to ensure that our school boards and our Board of Commissioners actually do what's best for our students and our community is if we have fair districts that actually represent the voters and give us a say in our schools and communities. I strongly urge all Georgians to stand up to this attempt to diminish our voice by staying involved and staying active. Stand up to politicians passing maps that disenfranchise your community and redouble efforts to mobilize members of your community in the face of this attack on our voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And last but definitely not least, we have the pleasure of welcoming Maria Sheik and Sadie McIntyre from the Georgia Youth Justice Coalition, here to share how our young activists are taking charge of their future and leaning into the fight against these local redistricting laws.
Hi, my name is Maria Sheik, and I am a Muslim American resident of Cobb County, Georgia. I also attend Cobb's public school system, which has rapidly diversified in the 10 years I have been a part of it. I'm here on the behalf of my many friends within our Georgia Youth Justice Coalition in Cobb, Athens, and Gwinnett school districts that are in class right now. They've been organizing tirelessly for months because as young Americans, we know that the maps drawn this year determine our future. We are the future, and the future is a diverse, multiracial democracy. Drawing maps that suppress local control and silence communities of color is a threat to that future. In this country, we like to pride ourselves on the concept of democracy, that every person has a say in representation. By letting a minority of legislators target Black and brown voters like my family to take over the local election process and draw biased maps, these politicians are dismantling that democracy. Growing up in Cobb as a young woman of color, I didn't have leaders who looked like me, a shortcoming that still persists today. It gives hope to see that in recent years, Gwinnett's majority-minority community has elected leaders for their school board and commission who not only look like them, but also listen to them. For our LGBTQ+, Muslim, Black, Hispanic, and other marginalized students here in Cobb, it would mean a lot to have a board who represents the diversity of the nearly 800,000 residents who are my neighbors. Cobb residents know what it's like to have politicians at the helm who aren't accountable. Because local politicians hijack the mapping process here, school board members know that they don't have to listen when marginalized community members ask their leaders to stand alongside them. Thus, members continue to push policies that censor students' free speech and enable hate against Jewish students and students of color. In Athens, politicians trying to win their next election put greed ahead of Black communities' right to representation. This is just wrong. The impact of politicians rigging election maps is clear. A small number of politicians intend to choose their own voters instead of voters choosing their leaders. They did so by drawing maps that suppress the voting power of parents and families of color in some of the largest counties And by signing these bills, our governor enables that attack on democracy. As a student of color in Georgia, the impacts of these maps on my family and community are clear. I know what it feels like to have my local community elect local leaders who represent us all. And I know what it feels like when politicians steal that right away from us just because they want to win elections. This past year, we've seen countless attacks on communities of color from the school board to the state house. Students are spit on and shouted at in school board meetings. Black elected officials are targeted by white supremacist groups, and policies that ban the teaching of Black history are being pushed forth by the sake of politicians, by the same politicians who just hijacked our local maps. Let's be clear, for the sake of my friends, my little brother and sister, my friends, and all of us, Georgians of color deserve the right to vote, to be represented, and to learn. Politicians have no place suppressing our votes, rewriting our history, demolishing local control, or weaponizing their opinions to middle and classroom. We deserve better, and we will continue to fight until all our voters and parents have the democracy we deserve.
Awesome. Thank you, Maria. My name is Sadie McIntyre, and I'm a current student in Gwinnett Schools here on behalf of my friends Abiha, Maria, Aunna, Jake, Addie, Aduni, Sinette, Lily, and more. All of us are students in Cobb, Gwinnett, and Athens who have been organizing for months with Young Georgians for Justice for fair local maps, because for us, maps are our future. Students with our coalition have been organizing alongside parents, community members, democracy advocates, and voters in each county, and we're so proud to continue this work. For us, this isn't just about an election this year. It's about the future that we as Americans and students will inherit. In Gwinnett and Cobb, we built powerful coalitions to speak out, share their stories, and inform voters. We know that politicians haven't done this necessary work to involve all of our community members in this critical, once-in-a-decade process. With our friends and partners, we ensured information on the impact of these maps, public testimony opportunities, translated materials, and legislators' contacts were all accessible to our communities. We did our part to ensure redistricting, which is supposed to be about ensuring our democracy accurately represents our ever-changing diverse communities, is told through the stories of real people, not politicians. Redistricting may seem boring, but it impacts our schools and democracies in vast ways. It determines whether the person who represents me thinks I deserve rights, fully funded schools, and a voice, or if that person can just draw a line on a map to remove me from their district so they don't have to listen to constituents. We've worked hard to transform the narrative around democracy, including holding events that platform Black and Brown families at the forefront of this fight, and we're not slowing down. We'll continue to work so that all of our parents, students, and voters achieve the local control and representation, which is every Georgian's right. We'll be spreading the word so that voters know who to call to demand better, that politicians know we see and abhor their political greed, and so that every voter can have a meaningful vote in upcoming elections. Whether you live in Powder Springs, Athens, or Lawrenceville, you deserve to choose your leaders instead of them choosing you. Politicians win when they change the rules without accountability. But make no mistake, we are watching, we are listening, and we are raising our voices. Georgians have been loud and clear in their calls against state politicians gerrymandering our maps, and we're not going away anytime soon. From the ballot box to the governor's office, calls and letters and protests, the Georgia Youth Justice Coalition is proud to continue the fight for our representation, our education, and our maps. We will not cede to political greed, not when our futures are on the line. Thank you to everyone in this fight alongside us.
Thank you, Maria and Sadie. We appreciate the work that you all are doing, as well as our other panelists. You each have shared some great insights and ideas that will help us fight the efforts of those who clearly are waging war on voting rights in Georgia and in our nation. It appears our guests have a few questions for you all. Please continue submitting any questions you have, and we will add them to the queue. While we may not be able to answer all of them, we will do our best to get to as many as possible. Kevin, do you have any questions for us?
Yes, we do. Our first question is from Crystal Dixon with Axios, and I can direct it to Poi Winichakul. Crystal asks if we have a planned legal strategy on this topic, since it's likely that Governor Kemp will sign these maps. She asks if we can share what's next in our plan.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I can say that we continue to deliberate on how to best defend the voices of communities of color in Georgia alongside the fantastic local activists, such as those that you've heard from today. They're putting in so much hard work across the state, and our advocacy will continue, and we will stay in touch with the press and the public about what that advocacy will look like.
Thank you, Poi. And now I'd like to direct a question to Aunna, if I may.
Sure, thank you.
Aunna, what are the best ways that Georgians can stand up to redistricting plans that crack or pack their community and diminish their voice?
So I think some of the key things is gathering with your community members, gathering with local advocates, talking to the media about literally what's happening in your communities with redistricting mapping, and also talking to your electeds to see what is their mapping process. Do they actually know the process that's happening in their county or their school board or with their local delegation in our Georgia legislature? At Common Cause Georgia and with our coalition partners at the Redistricting Alliance, and also working with some of our partners through our C4 table, we have been working to pass local resolutions in local communities to say, like, hey, we want ethical and transparent map making and drawing process in Georgia. We want our voices to be heard as a community. We want to make sure that we have a seat at the table, not just behind the closed door after the mapping process has happened. So we definitely, would like the public to join in with us to make sure that we can really hold our legislators, our local governments, our school boards accountable to the mapping process, because it represents us and it's about the voice of the community being heard and not about the special interests. So please reach out to Common Cause Georgia, reach out to me. Some of you all have my contact information. It definitely will be shared. Reach out to our Georgia Redistricting Alliance partners to see how we can best do this together, because we only are as strong as we're doing it together as a community to move Georgia forward. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Aunna. I'm going to direct another question to Poi.
Sure.
Poi, do you know what the timeline is for when these maps will go into effect and the approval process?
Yeah. So what we've got right now is the legislature has been introducing county level maps. So these are like the maps we've discussed today, County Board of Education and County Commission maps. And they're currently considering them. They go through the regular legislative process, which requires them to pass a bill, and then the governor has to sign them in order to approve them. We've heard from memorandums from each chamber that they encourage each chamber to consider these maps by mid-February. And as you can see, there are hundreds of maps that have already passed out of the legislature, and the governor has signed several of them. The Secretary of State has also shared a memorandum to election administrators around the country that they should have the new maps in place and input into their system by February 18th, which is come and gone now. So we really are seeing kind of the tail end of the approval process for these new maps. And again, that just shows you how quickly these maps have been moving, how little input communities have had into this process and into the substantive maps that have been put into place. And as has been discussed today, the lasting impact that has not on these communities that has frankly not quite been considered by the politicians who have been approving these maps and putting them into place across the state.
Thank you, Poi. I'm going to keep you on for a second because we're getting some follow-up questions. I think mainly about efforts to counter the maps, some specific questions about legal actions, but I'm wondering if you can elaborate on what are the best ways or options or things that would counter these maps that would stop them going into effect, whether that be legislation, advocacy, what options are available?
So these maps that are put into place are being put into place because there are new census numbers. When there are new populations of voters in counties, we have to go through this process called redistricting, and that's what triggers the redistricting process. But I believe there's nothing in Georgia law that prevents mid-decade recycling or redistricting. So what that means is that counties could redistrict mid-decade, but they would still have to go through this process with getting approval by the legislature. As is implied by the question, I think that there are some, one way that these maps can be prevented from being put into place or changed even after they have been put into place is through litigation. And we, along with many other legal groups who are involved in voting rights work, are taking a really hard look at these maps. If the maps themselves are not any indication, or excuse me, if the maps themselves are not any indication that that something is awry, you should look and listen to all the people who have spoken today. How can you draw maps without the input of the community who will be affected by these maps? How can you draw maps without considering what voters want, what voters need, and how they want to be represented and heard for the next decade? That alone raises serious doubt about the validity of these maps. And so that's something, and that the legal groups are taking into consideration as well.
Thanks, Poi. I want to open questions about how to counter this map out a bit, and I'm wondering if Sadie can elaborate a little more on the best ways to push back against these efforts by politicians in the Georgia State Legislature to redistrict communities.
Yeah, of course. With Georgia Youth Justice Coalition, our #1 strategy is pressure, applying pressure on these politicians, ensuring that they know that we will be holding them accountable no matter what the fate of these maps are. If these maps pass and we have harder districts to win in 2022 and years forward, then we'll organize electorally around getting the people who have passed these maps without considering their constituents out of office. It might be difficult, but we will continue to organize electorally, we'll continue to support legal efforts, and we'll continue to make our voices heard. This happens through social media, it happens through committee hearings, emails, calling, all of which we've led campaigns in and will continue to do so we can ensure fair districts for all students.
Thanks, Sadie. Do we have, sorry, just give me one moment to check the further questions. Okay, I'd like to address another question to Susanna. Susanna, who are Georgia's partners, business owners, or people with power who might be able to push back against these efforts?
Can you repeat the question one more time for me?
Sure. Who are some of Georgia's partners or people with power or organizations that would be able to push back against these efforts?
I mean, I think we can call on some of the big business leaders in the state who rely on Georgia citizens to like keep them profitable, to demand, better redistricting processes. That's one thing we can do. The legislature does listen to the big businesses that, are heavily invested in Georgia when it comes to these types of things. So definitely we can reach out to them and ask them to use their clout. We support them and keep them profitable. They can support us and make sure that we have a voice in our government that, is adequate and representative of the demographics of the state. And then we can use our collective voices to keep calling on them, on our legislature, to actually have fair redistricting processes. So I think all of these groups together, those of us who have been panelists today, as well as our wider groups like Georgia Redistricting Alliance, and organizations like that, can really speak out loudly and continue to press for better redistricting.
Thank you, Susanna.
Kevin, I believe we have another question, just a small clarifying question. And maybe I'll direct this to Poi first and leave it open to our other panelists to add. Poi, these maps will go into effect for the 2022 elections and beyond. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. And as a follow-up, and I think more of our panelists may be able to speak to this, we have a question from a Georgia resident who has let us know that the Asian American population in Metro Atlanta has increased dramatically in the last decade, similar to other southern states like Texas. However, they believe there was a lack of accessibility to non-English speaking residents during the 2021 redistricting hearing. How does the lack of accessibility play into organizing efforts and engaging with local government? And what are our coalition and advocacy partners doing to ensure that as we fight for more accessibility from local and state government, that our movements are also accessible to new and growing populations, especially in Metro Atlanta?
I think I'll take this one on, and the rest of the panelists, please fill in. So I know with the Georgia Redistricting Alliance, we've definitely tried to make an effort to make this process more accessible by having language interpretation of redistricting hearings, making a point that when we're working on our local resolutions, that we're adding in that we want transparency, but we do want materials and information and maps to be drawn that have other communities that are of interest, like-minded, with cohesiveness. And we want that to be taken into account. And we've also, asked when we've been doing testimonies at the legislature and during the hearing processes that we need in language interpretation, because we do realize that Georgia is not a state that just has one language here. We're not a state that has just one type of community. So we want our communities to feel welcomed into this process. We have to meet people where they are. And then also in Georgia, there are parts of Georgia that is covered under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. So there needs to be language interpretation so those communities can be a part of the process legally. So we've definitely been urging our legislature to have more processes where it can be more inclusive of other communities, and not just thinking that in Georgia, we are obviously just a monolith, I guess is what they feel about us down here, but we do need more transparent, inclusive processes that take into account other communities who are communities of interest and who are communities who are going to be impacted by the redistricting process and who would want to actually engage in their spoken languages so they can bring more people to the table to talk about how this is going to impact us collectively.
Thank you, Aunna, and that's exactly correct. Laura, would you like to speak to that next?
Hi, yes. As a local community member, I just want to say how fast and confusing this process has been as an English speaker. Most of us are not politicians. This legislative session, which 40 days, as I understand, has been moving extremely quickly, and they have been passing bills, and that is hard to keep up with. And a lot of things affect us in a lot of ways. And so as someone new to the process, because so many things are happening in my area, I've reached out to multiple groups, but also Capitol hearings, the committee hearings about these bills where you can speak up and speak out against them happen 1 o'clock in the middle of the day. So it's not as accessible for everyone to get down to the Capitol, as far as having other languages to explain what's going on. So they have made it, certain politicians have made it more difficult for the community members to know what's going on until it's time to vote. And then you're almost voting blind. And so what I've done as a community member is in the school groups that I'm involved in and in the community Facebook groups is that I try to let my community know what's going on, regardless of where I may stand on an issue. I let them know who to contact, because sometimes our politicians need to feel good if they're fighting alongside us too. So just trying to, if you're involved as a community member, try to get your neighbors involved too, regardless of where they stand on the issue, regardless of their speaking differences. Everyone should be involved in this process, not just the politicians.
Thank you, Laura. We're getting a question specifically about Gwinnett County. What should Gwinnett County residents look for? Is there anything to be done given the maps that have been already drawn? Sadie, I believe that you're from Gwinnett County, correct? So I'd be interested in your response to this if you have one, but if you don't know
Yes.
that specific, okay.
I know obviously legal strategy is the #1 way to combat these maps, but speaking from a different perspective, I am a proud Gwinnett County resident who loves our current Board of Commissioners and all of the efforts that they have made to make this process as accessible and transparent as possible. They've had many hearings in Gwinnett County about these maps, and the maps that they supported are not the ones that passed. So even their input did not go far within the Georgia General Assembly. But in order to combat that in Gwinnett, the most important thing is to get out and vote, register your friends, turn out at the polls, and combat all of the efforts that they have made to make it as difficult as possible. Show support for your county commissioners, especially the ones who have had their districts moved unfairly. But yeah, that's my piece.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any opinions or would like to weigh in on that question? Okay. Do we have any more questions from the press? Okay, seeing none, I think we can finish the briefing. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to all of our panelists for attending. Does anybody have any last thoughts or anything they want to share? Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.
Thanks, you guys too.
Thank you. Bye.